All right, everybody. So today we have the pleasure and honor to have Jerome presenting his work to us. As Jerome mentioned, we go back 17 years. We've known each other for a while now.
How's that possible?
Yeah. And Jerome's a close friend and a wonderful person, an artist, and architect, licensed architect, public artist, educator, assistant professor here, and our great coordinator for this studio, and the co-director of the Places Memory and Culture Incubator, which wouldn't have been possible without him writing the grant and doing all the work to make this happen. Also, it has a practice, Jerome Haferd Studio, and is a co-instigator, organizer of Dark Matter U, which, if you don't know
Which you are part of.
Yeah, which I was part of, and several people here have also been associated with, and has done this just really active and doing really wonderful things, really wonderful research. So can't wait to see the work. Thank you, Jerome.
Thank you, chat. Thank you, everybody. I know we've had a lot of folks come in this semester, but the idea is to, in this relatively informal space, just expose you to as much as we can. And I want to thank my faculty colleagues for all of us doing these talks. I'm now kicking myself for jumping and signing up to go this week. I was like, I'll do it. But we use these talks also for ourselves to practice. You're practicing, but it's really mutual. We're learning as much from you as you're learning from us. And so I'm going to share some work today, and I use this as an opportunity to sort of very quickly test out some new thoughts that I have not fully formed, but are kind of coming. And so I would love to hear your feedback either today or tomorrow on if this sparks anything for you, but I think it's things that we've been talking about in the course this semester, which of course has been sort of titled with this provocation of generative history. And I want to sort of pair that and to begin to think about a possible radical preservation. And if this word radical is often used, maybe overused, but I think it's a good word to really think about something which gets at the fundamental nature or a fundamental critique of something. I use this word and some ideas to sort of frame some of the work. But I also am using this talk, as the others are, to just show you a lot of things that I'm doing or have done, so that you all can begin to think about ways that you may chart a practice of your own, right? That is independent of a client, independent even of a professor asking you to do something, and independent certainly of the market, right? So this is a slide that I show that is just a kind of array of things that have to do with, that inform my so-called expanded practice. Built works in the office, teaching, research, activism. And then these are just some interests that I'm sort of oscillating within, these sort of larger discursive interests: history, geography, culture, and architecture. But when I start thinking about radical preservation, I started to spitball last night and today a few other things that I'm then going to try to use to organize the work that I'll show today, which is this, are these sort of concepts that begin, I think, to trouble a notion of preservation or of heritage and so on. So to begin with, this sort of notion of blackness or otherness, which is a kind of set of qualities or discourse that I am engaging in my work and that we're engaging, and that I think is a sort of generative project, right? And then that kind of brings us to ideas of erasure and the future, which I think if we then kind of insist that preservation sort of is always about the future, and that the future kind of has to be at stake, when we're talking about preservation. And then this kind of difference between preservation and heritage that I'm sort of being reminded to think about. And then also this idea of tangible heritage and intangible, and how things like blackness, otherness begin to sort of trouble that, as we've sort of discovered in Harlem already. And beginning to ask questions like these that I'm just sort of spitballing for us, that was in the top of our syllabus. What do we even mean when we say history? And by preservation or heritage? How do we memorialize outside of sort of the archive, or certainly of a kind of traditional archive, which we sort of have to do, right? And this begins to think about a more animate or living relationship with time or with our ancestors. And then, questions like what will we build with our reparations are things that colleagues who have inspired me have asked. But then to even get more maybe radical about that, what would we have built, let's say marginalized people, Black people, whoever, if we had had the resources and agency in the first place to chart our own sort of built environment. And this is going to be a seminar that maybe some of you have signed up for in the fall, so take it and come hang out with me. And I just saw this Instagram post last night and thought it was cool, so I put it on there. So beginning with sort of otherness, blackness, I'm going to just quickly go over some of my practice and my work, which is kind of circulating a lot of it around Harlem, where we are right now. To begin, just a couple autobiographical slides. I am originally from the Midwest. That's an image of me and my mother and my twin brother on the left there, which my sort of ancestry is very shaped by the built environment. The two sides of my family were very sort of organized by the redlining districts of Akron, Ohio, for instance. And then a sort of another reading of that geography would be of a kind of indigenous geography. And so my mother, who was a journalist but also a kind of amateur historian's work, in particular looking at the native people of that region, was really informative to me at a young age. And so I always keep that slide. And then this is a sort of pre-modern or prehistory map of where we are now, which I will talk about a little bit more, sort of Harlem, right? And here's a kind of more contemporary aerial image of Harlem, and in particular, Marcus Garvey Park, which I think many of you now know, which has been this kind of like microcosm or sort of micro locus of a lot of my creative practice. And of course, this sort of region in New York, for sure. And this is just an image of a kind of early project that I did with two collaborators, Brant Knapp and Jessica Feldman, back in 2014, which was sort of the first kind of built environment work of public art that we created at the top of that Acropolis in Marcus Garvey Park. And so since then, my kind of independent and collaborative practice has really developed out of a community-driven, intimate engagement model that's been really kind of focused on these sort of hinter or marginalized urban areas of New York, Astoria, Long Island City, the Bronx, Kingsbridge. There's an image of this sort of collaboration, but really led by Gerardo and his brother on the bottom in the Bronx, and of course Harlem. And then over the last several years now, as an architect, urban designer, and educator, my work has become increasingly concerned with how Black, Indigenous, and other historically marginalized subjects and spaces really kind of reorient architecture and reorient the sort of episteme of urban design, aesthetics, and so on, and sort of offer us kind of techniques or aesthetics that are kind of at the margins of the canon that certainly I was taught in school. Which in turn begins to inform other modes and values for professional practice, and that kind of circulates back into teaching and what we're doing right now. So these are images of a project of another kind of very sort of hyper-temporary installation in Marcus Garvey Park a couple years ago that was celebrating the incredible landscape architect Walter Hood, but that architecture really existed in a state of phases, which was a sort of procession and then band shell and then a kind of canopy or arbor, all within the span of about an hour, right? And it sort of celebrated and imaged history, but also kind of these qualities that again are sort of denigrated in our discipline, like softness, fabric, weaving, some of the things you all are exploring in your work now. So this was a plan of that kind of quilt, which was sort of indexing an archive of the park. And then I'll just quickly show this sort of has led or is happening in tandem with other sort of collaborations in Harlem, like this project with a local painter named Thomas Heath for the Harlem Renaissance Pavilion, where we sort of worked with a kind of series of his paintings to produce this sort of super shed that's still there on 139th Street during the height of COVID. And it's a kind of research which begins to kind of continually ask, how do we weave these stories into these emergent forms of public space and cultural infrastructure in the city? And these have sort of, these public space projects are kind of characteristics of the practice, which also includes these sort of neighborhood projects, client-driven work in Harlem, but also sort of around the region. There's an image of a small project I did with National Black Theater. Okay, so getting into erasure and futurity, or fabulation, which I know some of you have been thinking about as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Harlem African Burial Ground, which has sort of been this important project. So again, this sort of like current arc of my work really began around 2018, 2019, where this work in Harlem intersected with my own questioning of history and the discipline that led to a deeper inquiry into sites of Black and Indigenous erasure in particular. And so the Harlem African Burial Ground, which is shown above in the middle and outlined there, became this kind of research, but also kind of activism, because this is a site that's under development, and thinking around those issues that I began to conduct at this site alongside other folks. And so here's an aerial view of that site today, where the city is basically planning to develop that site. But what you notice is there's, even from the aerial view, there's really nothing that marks, spoiler alert, there's nothing marking this sort of very important ancestral space, right? It's sort of absent from almost any archive, and certainly the individuals buried there exist as sort of traces in the archive. I'm looking at Mo because he knows all about this. And so the plan to construct a kind of everyday urbanism at this site really kind of challenged me, and I think challenges us, because I don't think, in the words of actually Walter Hood from this podium around that time, we don't have a language as a discipline to kind of address this, was sort of the challenge. Yes. And certainly this idea of a living memorial, right? So I quickly kind of realized that trying to meaningfully engage this site requires us to open up new ways of understanding history, right? Which are kind of essential to creatively or ethically generating new conceptual frameworks and forms of design that's not going to duplicate the harm, the environmental harm, the archival violence that's sort of got us here in the first place, right? And so the water's edge begins to enter as a protagonist. And this sort of image in the early research of I think this was the 2050 flood map, kind of indexes and becomes this transhistoric document, right? That I think in particular water kind of provokes. So it indexes the prehistory of the site and the original edge of the so-called Harlem River, which would have been also a kind of Lenape trading ground and a site of burial and internment of the early enslaved individuals in this neighborhood. And and so I introduced into this work the work of scholars, so people like Marisa Fuentes and Saidia Hartman, who is her mentor, who we've also been talking about, who some of my colleagues work with. who are kind of experimental historians and authors. And I put the sort of definition of this idea of critical fabulation. That's Saidia and Marisa Fuentes, who I befriended, who lived at the time a few doors down from me on 127th Street, was sort of working on in her work, right? And so she writes that she had to learn to speak the language of other disciplines, geography, law, architecture, in order to mount creative forms of scholarship, such as critical fabulation, by creating a speculative history to generate a living subjectivity to these individuals who don't exist in our archives, right? And so I wrote this piece and kind of began to ask, can we architects, urban designers, etc., do what Fuentes and Hartman are doing, but in our discipline, right? Or in our transdisciplinarity, to mount new methods of architectural resistance to our own discipline's form of violence, okay? Can we motivate radical speculative forms of architecture? And these are just some more images of different artists and different kind of documents of this site. That's a kind of ongoing question, and then bringing in, again, other folks like the work of Torkwase Dyson and Mario Gooden into this conversation, Nia and others. And to begin to kind of enroll architecture and urban design in ways that attribute agency to the land, to local residents, and preempt climate change, right? And this is some of the work of the first studio that I conducted here at Spitzer ever, the student work. I'm going to show some student work that began to think about a kind of living memorial on that site as a sort of ethic that pervades the entire project and is not this sort of like place I go to receive an emotion or like receive a memory, right? And this I think this was the one project that really began to kind of speculate about the water in relationship to that and sort of fabulate materials and so on. And this work was then presented with the sort of descendant community and in collaboration with them. Okay, so then I'm going to see if these words hold up as I try to frame my work through them. I'm just going to talk about a few more kind of regional sites that I think tie into these ideas of preservation, of tangible, intangible history that are kind of also connected to the research and teaching that I'm doing. So the first one, so since the Harlem studio, I really kind of embarked on the practice to a number of sort of regional projects, a lot of them along this kind of Appalachian corridor over the last couple of years, which again are engaging kind of marginalized history, new modes of kind of ideas of preservation, heritage landscape, cultural infrastructure. And this is a quick view of just one of those ongoing projects. It's called Restoring the Potomac, and that's with several collaborators of mine, including my twin brother. And where's my mouse? Obviously, Washington, D.C. is at the mouth of the Potomac River, but we're working way back at the source of the Potomac River, much less discussed, which is this kind of BIPOC-led land justice and sort of programming, archive, and memorialization project. There's an aerial view of this landscape where this group called Roots to Sky are located in close proximity to the source of the Potomac River, which is marked by a British colonial marker called the Fairfax Stone, which we're basically attempting to kind of like unlearn and undo, essentially. So these are just a couple images of that work. I led a studio here which traveled to the site and met with some of the sort of protagonists involved in this project and began to sort of speculate a kind of new kind of heritage architecture or interpretive architecture to sort of resuscitate these stories at the source of the Potomac River, right? And then that's become a kind of series of building and exhibition projects. So then to kind of show how some of this is linking to the teaching, I always just throw up a few courses that are happening, most of them here at Spitzer, but some elsewhere. And so, these courses are really feeding into the practice, right? And the middle one, was the year-long course that I taught here last year, which was also part of the fall seminar. This one I'll talk about from last fall, and this is a kind of ongoing series of seminars called Fugitive Practice. And that kind of brings me very briefly to touch on what Chat mentioned, which some of these courses, like Fugitive Practice, are really attempting to also question the institution and the sort of container by which we produce knowledge, because I think the content that I'm trying to get at requires a questioning of this container, right? So that sort of manifests in something like Dark Matter University, which is this sort of network of people at many different institutions, at many different stages of their career, who are in kind of periodic and constant dialogue with one another and create courses and pedagogy together, sort of within, without, and inside and outside of existing institutions. And so just a shameless plug, this was now a couple months old, but we took over the October issue of Architect magazine last year. It's one of the last print issues of that magazine. So if you have one, it's going to be valuable someday. And you should also read it. Pedro Cruz has a piece in it. I have a piece in it, and so on. And then, we're, again, rethinking the content and container of knowledge production. So something like Fugitive Practice is really this idea, which is co-taught always, which a course I created between Yale University and Howard with Curry Hackett, who's a great colleague, where we began to where the ambition of the course was to introduce, explore, and recenter Black and Indigenous design methods, right? And there's some intellectual output of that, but this is just showing you a few of the chapters of that seminar, which I think will resonate with what y'all are doing, some of you, which really just began to explore layering and weaving, embodiment and dance, reappropriation, marronage, and urbanism and mapping as kind of fugitive practices, right? Which we can talk about much longer later. And then that work has begun to kind of inform these sort of more recent studios. This was a graduate studio here, which was taught over last year that I mentioned, which is, again, looking at these sort of legacies and histories of Maroons and sort of outsidership and sovereignty as a way to, again, instigate ideas, always going back to ideas of design, architecture, urban design, okay? And the reason I bring this one up is because I'll show a series of sites that I think are sites of kind of radical preservation that we worked in for the studio. So this is some of the kind of scholarly work we were engaging, in particular Tiffany Lathabo King's Black Shoals. Woo! Get it, read it. Where she, as a kind of literary scholar, begins to create a new ground to think the encounter between Black and Native studies, for example. And we focused on this sort of territory that's kind of the other arc of that Appalachian region, which I'm like getting back home is the idea with these classes, trying to get back to Ohio. And looked at this kind of geography of Great Migration, which is my sort of ancestral geography on my father's side, coming from the South. And then began to conduct some case studies in these sort of three sites of sort of radical preservation, we might say, but you may prove me wrong or say I'm full of crap next semester if anyone takes the course, I don't know. Cleveland, in the sort of Cuyahoga and Ohio River Valley, with Pittsburgh and Cleveland. The first one being the McKees Rocks neighborhood outside of Pittsburgh, where there is this native burial mound that doesn't exist anymore, right? But is still a sort of sacred ancestral site. There's a lot to say here, but this site provoked us to, again, kind of question, similarly to the Harlem African burial ground, how do we begin to kind of reanimate a kind of interpretive relationship to this site when this sort of like object of preservation was destroyed, okay? Through kind of colonial extraction. Spoiler alert. And so this is some of the student work from that studio, which began to kind of reintroduce a kind of mound practice as a kind of living interpretive practice and a ceremonial practice on the site.
Can you go back to that other one for a minute?
And then the next place was Cleveland, very close to where I'm from, and this group, Third Space, and who are attempting to do a sort of, again, living archive, resuscitatory practice along what they call Chocolate City Corridor, which is East 105th Street, which would have been the kind of heart of a kind of Great Migration geography, where black folks in the 20s through the 70s, 60s were coming up and settling in the north in places like Cleveland, Chicago, the Rust Belt, New York, Harlem. And a lot of that has been also no longer exists. The Cleveland Clinic and other institutions, developers have essentially erased a lot of this sort of physical geography, physical heritage. But this group is sort of maintaining that there's a lot of still intangible heritage by which we might mount a kind of radical preservation and sort of imagine a kind of black belt or black architecture that can fabulate a sort of imaginary out of that, right? So this is a student project in dialogue with those folks that began to image some of this, which connects. I'm just going to show a few more like real projects that I do in the practice, which is connecting to some of these ongoing more residential scale projects that I've been doing in these sort of regional cities like Cleveland with the side-by-side project, or St. Louis with this project, Beautiful Browns, that Curry and I designed and won second place in this competition while we were teaching fugitive practice together to sort of test some of those ideas. And then finally, this project, which is quite remarkable for the National Opera House in Pittsburgh, or the National Negro Opera House, which is this kind of like space of marronage, I argued, and was the site where we went and presented the work of these amazing students, and is being kind of, again, restored in terms of a kind of exterior restoration, but the interior is free to be sort of more radically reimagined by this group in ways maybe like this, where Erykah Badu is sort of reclining on this seat. And that kind of brings us to the work of the Incubator, which you're all now participating in, which launched this year, where we actually used that image in the press release. And so the Incubator, just going to talk very briefly about the fall, where we returned to the Harlem African Burial Ground. I've now brought you 5 years in like 20 minutes, and revisited the Water's Edge through this sort of first studio course of the Incubator, supported by the Incubator, where Nia, who presented her work, became a kind of collaborating protagonist and co-faculty of the course, where we, again, sort of allowed memorial practice, ancestral practice to kind of trouble the notions of a kind of static memorial architecture. And then I'll briefly share one of the projects from that studio, which was done by our illustrious TA Mo and Lorraine. And Lorraine. Or Lorraine and Mo, who did this fantastic kind of archival practice and imaging project, which then sort of informed a kind of more maybe knowably architectural proposal of that site, which is going to sort of feature a lot of square footage. And so their project looked at how to haunt the site with a kind of hauntology, if you will. But you're going to ask Mo or Nia about that, because they'll tell you more. And then, of course, what we're doing now in our studio with 125th Street, and I think we're obviously interrogating all of these different concepts, right? So I'm just going to end with a few sort of recent work that's on the boards or happening right now that I think, again, kind of brings home these questions of imaging history in the built environment, how cultural history, aesthetic imaginaries that exist at the margins of our canon sort of can be brought back to the center of a practice. And then again, like how I'm, especially with the last project with Africa Town, kind of looking at sort of how do we bring together ideas of heritage landscape, interpretive landscape, and sort of reparations, right? So this is Sankofa. Has anyone seen Sankofa? Gone to see it? All right, so you guys know what this is. Well, this is one of the drawings that we did at the beginning. So this is this installation that I was really fortunate. Though be careful what you wish for when you get tapped to do something, because you're going to work your ass off. But this is this incredible project being done in community. I live in this community a few blocks from here. We're back at Marcus Garvey Park with also Harlem Grown, this incredible local organization. And we were charged with creating a kind of modular architecture that would deploy over a couple years. And through this sort of engagement process, not unlike what some of you are doing or what all of my colleagues do, it immediately became clear that these folks who sort of joined me, some of whom I knew, in this process were really challenging even me to think about the aesthetics of a kind of pavilion architecture in New York City, the aesthetics of what a modular architecture is, and how that shows up in a place like Harlem and sort of belongs in this space. So these are some of the kind of sketches and collages that really, I think, informed the kind of ancestral and futuristic aesthetics of this installation. There's a kind of axonometric drawing on the right. And a kind of, again, layering, weaving, imaging of histories that can happen through that canopy and the sort of interior rotunda or round space that becomes a rotating art gallery, that is really designed to sort of showcase as much art, as much community art as possible, was the sort of program of the project. And so, yeah, and also to, your clients or organizations will have, and you will have all of these programmatic ideas, but the real test is just like soft program, which is what people are going to do to a place 90% of the time, is just exist there. And that's also something to think about when you're designing a piece of built environment. And I added these slides because it's transforming this year. So be on the lookout. In a couple weeks, the canopy is going to transform to its second year into what we're calling Drexia, which is a collaboration between myself, Gabriel Perez, and 3 local Black women artists, Ilan Cadiz, Laura Gadsden, and Nia Love, who's right here. And this is images of their work that is sort of informing the Drexia canopy. Real quick, I'll talk about this project, which is really exciting, and I can now start to show images of as I run out of time. But this is also at the water's edge. This is a permanent artwork that's kind of coming off the heels of Sankofa. That's part of this new revitalization, though I don't love that word, restoration, reimagining of the East River Esplanade. And I was selected to produce a public artwork in collaboration with Marvel Architects and Stantec that you see there in this drawing, who are 2 other firms that sort of come to bear on a project of this size. And again, the concept image of the project is this practice that happens right across the river at Randall's Island, which again kind of is this pan-indigenous, you could say, call or reminder of like how we gather at the water. We all do this, we used to do this, and many people still do this, and we're invited to continue to do it, is essentially the idea of this piece called Water Table, which is going to also, again, sort of through its materiality and technique, allow for a kind of imaging of histories by certain protagonists, and also image the history of that space, of that site, of that location, and the waterways that have now been covered over. And I want to give a shout out to Pedro, who's been working on this with me in the office. And that's the latest image of that. And so I will close with this project, this capital A architecture for you all to see, which is this winning competition entry from last year for Africa Town. Does anyone here know what Africa Town is? All right, well, you're about to learn, because you do need to know. So Africa Town is a sort of district or just outside of Mobile, Alabama. It's right on the water's edge. And it is also entered the kind of popular consciousness a few years ago because it's the site where they rediscovered the last slave ship, quote unquote, the Clotilda, okay? So Africa Town is this kind of really critical, fascinating place where there is this coherent connection back to Africa for African Americans and Black Americans. Sort of one of the only places where that's a kind of there's a sort of coherent archive, and a coherent archive through the boat, through this ship, which provokes all sorts of additional questions, right? And so they mounted several organizers, including Renee Rotan and a few others from the community, put forth this very ambitious international design competition. It went for a couple years. They kept extending it. And it sort of crossed numerous sites. And my practice entered one of the sites, Site 2. Here's some images, from the kind of press about the ship. And the sort of existing conditions of housing and industrial infrastructure that sort of characterize this place. But anyway, I'm going to sort of read a sort of passage from the narrative of this project, of our design proposal, which is titled In the Wake, as I just scroll through some of these images, and I'll see if this works. This may not work. Okay. I need my mouse. Okay. What does it mean to be in the wake? Writer Christina Sharp asks this as she ponders Blackness as existing in the paradoxical wake of loss, slavery, ceremony for the dead, and emergence. Our team understood and understands this site, the Josephine Allen Houses site, as the transition point from land to water, an in-between that is neither land or sea. Our proposal attempts to embrace and render material this condition of in-betweenness that we see again and again in the Black diasporic experience. So Site 2 in the Wake embraces this in-between of water and land urbanistically, architecturally, materially, and conceptually. On a conceptual level, we seek to tap into the woven co-indigeneity of stewardship, both native and African, and the kind of doubleness of Cudjo Lewis and his descendants, and a doubling of ground and surface. The literal layers, if I go here, that begin to define a new relationship to earth and water. And so the position of this imaginary is to think of the ground, the sky, and the social plane as layered, billowing, and porous. At the macro scale, the urban design, and this is the sort of Clotilda boathouse proposal, of the site stitches or weaves a new infrastructural entrance of the site to the north, from the north, and then grades or coaxes the floodplain, a new floodplain, into the site from the south. At the meeting of these two, the Africa Town Museum, the Clotilda boathouse and the gatehouse help to define a new civic plaza and memorial park. And so, again, I think something like Africa Town And one day, hopefully something will actually be built of this, or something like this built by the community, I think really comes full circle and is dealing with these questions of radical preservation, of how might the land itself be the broker of our reparations? How do we instantiate a interpretive landscape in a kind of existing living place? And I want to end with a little note because I think I would be remiss not to. So this is the gateway of baptism, which sort of sinks us into the water. But when we talk about sort of the transatlantic slave trade and these sort of atrocities, these historic atrocities, as crime, and we describe them as crimes against humanity, I think it's really important to reiterate that this is not like over. And this is not the past. And that these crimes against humanity were not only legal, but encouraged and sort of foundational to our existing nation and our nation states. All right, thank you. All right, that wasn't too long. All right, any questions? Yes?
So there's so much that you've done and so much that you have kind of created a multiplicity of conversations and places of didactism, like how to really think about not only teaching but facilitating this tangibility and intangibility. And so my question is, as you continue to work in this vein, in this way as an architect and an artist, what are some of the challenges that you have had over the last 7 years, and could you speak to some of the, and what I mean by challenges, could you also speak to some of the lessons that you've learned with growing such a vast kind of structure that lives outside the institution, inside the community, and in your own personal life?
Yeah. Sleep. No.
Or lack thereof.
I mean, I think the question that probably a lot of us and you all will, many of you will ask yourselves, I think my colleagues up here ask ourselves is frankly, one of the questions is, how big to grow your practice and how to do that and how to marshal individuals and labor towards your projects, frankly. And if one even has the privilege to even make that decision, right? Where, I think architecture, I've had, even people in this building will comment things, will say things like our profession is kind of broken. If I put on my architect hat for a minute, which I think is like kind of part of an expanded hat, in the sense that, we've inherited this idea of being this sort of like genteel, privileged, sort of moneyed, propertied kind of subject who has sort of patrons of empire to build your project. And so I think in some ways it's also a blessing, but it is a challenge to have these people I admire, like the folks I've worked for, these sort of giants of our canon, of our field, and the desire to build, like work at a certain scale at some point, and the kind of the sort of the capitalism of that, and the sort of labor, the sort of labor practices that come to bear on producing a piece of architecture. I think it's complex and ethically complex. So that is, I think, an ongoing thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Rob, what you thinking?
A lot of things.
You gotta tell me.
Like the thing that got to me is your background from coming to this, because I didn't know about like your actual like family background of being both. I forgot the region itself. But I just remember
Midwest?
Yes, Midwest. That's the main part that came up in my head. But like, at one point you did move to Harlem, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you spoke about what brought you to Harlem, did you?
Ah, yeah. Honestly, I think I moved to Harlem at the time, one, following a few people I knew who had moved to Harlem, including my design collaborator at the time. I think there was a sense, I was also moving in with my now life partner, who is African American. And I think there was, I think it just was this almost inevitable thing. There was a sense of wanting to just make a life in that neighborhood in a way that I had been living in Brooklyn, and it didn't feel like the stakes were quite the same. And at the time, it was a little bit cheaper, and it ain't no more. But it was a little bit cheaper too. But no, it just felt, I don't know, there wasn't an explicit, like, this has to be the place, but there were many small reasons that just seemed like that was the kind of next place.
I'm asking is because the amount of influence Harlem had on your work.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like, every work I've seen so far, and even visiting the Marcus Garvey one, before knowing you were going to be my professor, is, I was like, kind of at, like, this is a massive structure, and people are, like, you said soft programming, where people just use, I saw that being done very well. It's like, even I just wanted to sit in there, because not only did I see like a beautiful structure, I just want to have some like shade.
Yeah.
I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like the influence Harlem had on your work is very fascinating.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. Yep. Definitely.
I know we mentioned in my question out there, but like how a lot of your projects connect to your personal family history and kind of like the lineages you come from. I was wondering if you could maybe speak more about it, or kind of like how does working on those projects kind of help you find answers in your own family history or your own legacy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, that's a great question. I think not everybody necessarily has that same sort of like mindset, and you know, there's also a way of kind of framing the work, but I do think we bring ourselves to our work, and I think it's important to do that. And with the burial ground research, I remember like riding my bike by that site every day, and then also being really nervous to teach that studio, because on one hand I felt like, am I black enough to teach this studio? Am I proximate enough to this? You know, given a kind of mixed ancestry, and then also literally wondering if I have relatives buried there, right? Like holding those two things simultaneously. And also, it was that was happening around a time that I was actually recovering some of my own sort of erased archive from my black side of my family. But yeah, I don't know, it's just kind of happened. Not every project is sort of like resonates with you in that way, but I think there's a way of sort of charting oneself that you can kind of bring yourself to your work in a way.
Curious, how did you end up doing the work that you're doing? Like, were you always interested in thinking about preservation and geography and indigeneity, or are you coming from more design and then kind of like shifting into this and realizing, oh, this is your home? Like, how did you get here?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in some ways, yeah, there's a lot, and that's why I start with that slide of like expanded practice and like these weird things I'm doing, and some people are like, why aren't you just building buildings, which is absolutely valid, and like there are days when I'm like, I just want to like sit down and just draw a building and not think about anything else. I think some of it has to do with people who influenced me. You know, I worked for a while in Bernard Shumi's office, who's sort of like a famous architect, but also like a scholar and an academic. And so in some ways there was that sense of like both of those things and holding both of those things in a practice, though it's really hard to do that, and it sort of can limit and does limit a building practice and vice versa. So yeah, I think just folks I've looked up to, a lot of the folks I really look up to have a kind of expansive aspect to the way they academicize their work, or are kind of like multidisciplinary in how they're working. Yeah, but there's a lot of different practice models. And to do certain things, you do have to edit yourself. You can't do everything. Even though I try to do everything, but you really can't. And so it's really looking at who do I admire and why do I admire that person and what are they doing. Yeah, last question.
Yeah, for me, I'm kind of interested in how you balance creating pieces to create connections with people who are part of that culture versus people who don't understand it and are trying to understand it. So how do you like balance that to make sure there's an even amount where I could come in and learn while someone could come in and connect?
Sure. I will say that, yeah, I actually sometimes I have slides where this colleague of mine, Stephen Gray, gave this beautiful sort of text to me and to some others at one point where he talked about how, for example, Blackness may seem on the surface like this exclusive discourse, but it's actually this extremely inclusive discourse vis-a-vis racism, which is a fundamentally exclusive discourse, or you could even say whiteness. And so I also think that I don't think that necessarily everything has to be fully legible to everybody. When I went through architecture school, there was a lot of things they were talking about that I did not have a reference point for. I was like, what is all this stuff? We're talking about, minimalism in France in the 1920s. We're talking about, whatever. So I don't think things are always going to be perfectly accessible to everybody, and I think that's kind of okay. It's really about acknowledging the sort of equal value of different sort of cultural perspectives and a kind of invitation to participate, right? Does that make sense? All right. Thank you, everybody.